All right, so for our class today on April 18th, I'd like to discuss Harriet Jacobs' narrative and compare Harriet Jacobs' narrative with Wench and possibly with aspects of Stella to think about ways that Harriet Jacobs recognizes that she lives in a culture that has a very oppressive, dominant narrative, but also a set of oppressive laws, which are slavery. When we think about the era of reform from 1830 to 1865, we might think of two major reform movements, although there were several: anti-slavery and women's rights. So anti-slavery was one of the broadest reform movements. It had the greatest impact because anti-slavery did help bring things to the point of civil war, and also the anti-slavery reformers had an impact on what happened after the Civil War, particularly the 15th Amendment and the enfranchisement of African American men, granting African American men full citizenship and the right to vote. Now that took a lot of fighting from anti-slavery activists to not just end slavery, but also make black men citizens. Women, however, black or white, didn't gain citizenship. And that really pissed off Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and a lot of the white feminists. Frances Harper and Harriet Jacobs, and possibly Sojourner Truth, who are all black feminists, were like, well, we're going to be a lot better off now that some black people can vote, so we'll take what we can get for now. So that's often perceived, in 1865, we often perceive a fracturing or a break between women's suffrage or women's rights and abolition or anti-slavery or African American civil rights. I really want this bug to leave out. Here, come outside. I think it's a big fat fly.
A big fat fly. That's right, dear.
There you go. Go. As fast as I can. Okay, I had to get that bug out of the room. So today, when we talk about Harriet Jacobs' narrative, which you can find in assignments and in a folder called Jacobs, we can compare some of the things that she says about her role as a woman and her role as a person who was enslaved, and compare and contrast them with Stella or with Wench. I think the comparisons are interesting. So in this folder, we have the video with the background about Jacobs. We have some specific excerpts from incidents. We have a video that I made that introduces Harriet Jacobs. If you have insomnia and you like to watch the videos I make to help you get to sleep. And what?
I just laugh.
You just laugh? Okay. Do you laugh? Do you ever watch the videos and laugh too?
I do.
We also have the full text of incidents. That's what we'll actually use today. And what we'll do is just search some words in incidents and think about using a digital shortcut tool to help us find exactly where we want to compare incidents with Wench. And then the last thing that we have here is a quiz on Jacobs, because I still have to make the last quiz on Wench, and I've been really a bad teacher in not making that. But many people in this class will benefit from having more quizzes to take and having more exams to take to bump up those points totals. So I was just talking to Jennifer, and there are a few other people in the School of Nursing in this class, about Mary Seacole. So if we just start here are some images of Mary Seacole, a British Jamaican businesswoman and nurse who set up the British Hotel behind the lines during the Crimean War. She described this as a mass table and comfortable quarters for sick and convalescent officers, and provided succor for wounded servicemen on the battlefield. Born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1805, died in London in 1881. The Crimean War, we need to also Google here. It's probably if I just clicked on. Probably if I just clicked on Wikipedia, it would have a link. So rather than watching me try to type, yeah, that's going to link us to the Crimean War. So here's some background and some pictures of Seacole. Now, part of why I'm talking about Seacole is because she lived in the same historical moment as Harriet Jacobs. She was born almost at the same time. And she died a little bit sooner. Harriet Jacobs, I think, lived into the 90s. But we all know how I am with dates. So it's interesting to compare these two women. Harriet Jacobs, of course, lived a life of extreme confinement because she was enslaved. And she spent 7 years in the top garret of the shed on her master's property, hiding from him so he would think that she ran away, but so that she could still watch her children and see her children. So when we think about the difference between Mary Seacole sailing around the world, starting her own business, creating the field of nursing, and Harriet Jacobs being confined to the attic of a shed, a space not a lot bigger than this table, it's a really remarkable contrast. But both of these women are path breakers in terms of challenging dominant narratives of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a person of African descent in the era of reform. So I think they're both incredibly exciting figures. So Jennifer, I would recommend that you do just a project on Mary Seacole that, just tells us about her, because we haven't gone into depth about her, but her autobiography is probably in the same place where we can find the Jacobs full text. So this is the Digital Schomburg of African American Women Writers of the 19th Century. And this is the digital or the electronic edition of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl.
So, if we do a paper, do we have to present it in front of the class, or do we just turn in the paper to you?
You don't have to present to the class if you want, but I want to take all of our final products and make them available so that everybody in the class can learn from them. Therefore, there will be...
If I do a PowerPoint thing, what's the limit, 5 minutes, 6 minutes presentation or something?
You can if you'd like, yeah.
It's not mandatory.
It's not mandatory. It's not mandatory, but you can earn more points that way. Okay. And therefore avoid doing other assignments. So you just pick whatever is the lesser of your evils. So I'm trying to find the home page here because I'm pretty sure we have Seacole, but let me just Google it instead. Okay, here's looks like a BBC. Maybe they have a documentary about her, Wikipedia. Lots of articles about Mary Seacole that are written by scholars, which are typically very difficult to read. National Portrait Gallery images of her. There should be a digital copy of her narrative. I'm not going to spend too much time looking for that at the moment, but I just want to show you the Schomburg Center for Black Art and Culture is part of the New York Public Library. So this nypl.org is the part of the website for the New York Public Library. The Schomburg Center is a repository and archive about Black culture. So they have rare books, documents, a research center, fellows who come and do particular research. They have letters between Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, for example, with Langston's original signature. Or they have the first handwritten copies of poems by someone like Langston Hughes. It's a really exciting library and place. But one of their features is their digital collections. When I was a graduate student, I used to have to go to New York City to study at the Schomburg, which really broke my heart. No, not really. I love going to New York City. I was like, oh, I'll have to have another research travel grant to go to New York City. It was really awesome. But now they put things online, which is also nice for undergraduates who don't have time or access to go to New York City and do your research. So we can browse by author. We can look at fiction, poetry, biography, and autobiography or essays. All of these are by 19th century Black women writers, meaning texts written between 1800 and 1899, written and published by Black women. So the very fact that these exist is in itself remarkable. This list is only the autobiographies and the autobiographies and the narratives. So they include Harriet Jacobs in the autobiographies because it's a true story. Elizabeth Keckley was the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln. So her story was a kind of scandalous tell-all. It was like the reality TV of the Lincoln administration because she could tell everything about the Lincolns. She was really close to Mary Todd Lincoln. And Mary Prince has 2 different publications. She's West Indian. So there are at least 100 texts, I think, in this digital collection. So keep in mind, at least 100 published books by Black women in a century that's primarily marked by slavery. I think that's something to be really proud and excited about. So Mary Seacole's Wonderful Adventures don't seem to be here. I'm going to try one more time. The Wonderful Adventures, bless you, of Mrs. Seacole can get from the University of Pennsylvania Digital Library. And that looks like an original cover. Now think about the contrast just in titles. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl versus The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole. Incidents sounds like a police incident, and it is. It's about things that happened because of slavery and that captivity and confinement. Wonderful Adventures, on the other hand, this woman traveled the world and did amazing things and started businesses and started nursing. She also is not a slave girl. She is Mrs. Seacole. She announces herself as a lady of stature and standing and maturity. And here we have a few images published a few years before Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in England. So let's go back. So this is the UPenn Digital Library, and let's go back to Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Before we start, do you have any questions about Harriet Jacobs or Wench or anything that you'd like to know so far? Okay. So because this is a digital text, we can do a search within the text, and that's a really cool way to study a text without having to read the whole thing. It is not something that I could do in graduate school. I had to actually read the whole thing and look for words and count how many times the word showed up. Yeah. So when we think about either Stella or Wench, or even about contemporary issues that some of you have identified that still have relevance in our dominant culture and in our cultures of resistance, like Black Lives Matter and Black Girl Magic and Me Too and all of that stuff, what kind of keywords do you think about that we might want to look for in Jacobs and see what she has to say about those concepts and ideas? Shiloh, are you writing about incidents and wench or just wench or?
I'm writing about both.
Yeah. So have you started to compare the two yet?
Right now I'm talking about wench, and then the next paragraph I'm going to talk about incidents, and then I'm going to compare both.
Okay.
Or compare and contrast.
So what are you identifying as the important themes in wench?
Hold on.
Do you want me to look at our email exchange, or you just want?
I'm kind of like comparing now to like I'm kind of comparing the system now, like how we identify the system now and the things that we can obviously see that are wrong with the system to back then, where the things that we believe are wrong now,
Mm-hmm.
they may not have thought were wrong. Like, not necessarily like they may not have thought they were wrong, but like they chose to identify it as a positive rather than a negative, like we do now, if that makes sense.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Like one of the things that I'm choosing to talk about is like how I think that now if the Drill and Lizzie situation would have happened, a lot of like let's say Lizzie's family, they would have been like they would have tried to like be like, hey, like don't do this, like blah blah blah, like in our world now.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas back then she didn't really have anybody. And then she chose to like love Drill because like that was all she had, and like that was all she knew, and so that was kind of her way of resisting oppression.
Okay, so you said a lot of smart things, and I'm just going to summarize them because I'm recording this so the people that miss class can hear it. So first of all, I like to use this term dominant narratives of oppression, which is just stories of how people are treated unfairly. You're talking about systemic oppression or systems of oppression that include slavery or policing systems, sometimes educational systems, the foster care system. When you were talking about what would have happened with Drill and Lizzie today versus what happens in the story, Lizzie didn't have a family, so maybe we could imagine that as a situation where Drill is her foster father. So if a girl who had no family went into foster care, and apologies for comparing the foster care system to slavery. That's really problematic in a lot of ways, obviously. But there were also 5 lawsuits in South Carolina in the past couple of years that did exactly that, where kids who were in foster care or young adults who had been in foster care pretty much said they had no rights and they were abused, and that it was the responsibility of the government to protect people, especially children. And it didn't happen. So it was pretty much the same thing where laws like slavery make children vulnerable. Laws like foster care, that was the argument in the legal case. So if Lizzie were a child in foster care and Drill was her father, and then she showed up pregnant and they realized that he was the father, he would have gone to jail. But something that you're saying, and so that's an example of systemic oppression where at least today he would have had to be punished. But part of what you're saying that's interesting too is that Lizzie had no other resource to better her life and survive than love. So we can be like, oh, that's bad, that's wrong. We can judge all that we want, or we can stop and think, wow, she really did the best that she could, and she's a resourceful, smart, brave young woman for doing what she did, which is putting a different spin on it, challenging the dominant narrative that's judgmental about women's choices and saying, hey, in this situation, she made a good choice. Not that you're arguing that, but I think it's a really interesting question. So Lizzie used love as the only tool that she had for survival. Let's see what Harriet Jacobs says about love. So I just typed love down in the search down here. And it turns out she uses the word love 44 times in the narrative. The very first time she uses the word love it's a mother's love. And then she talks, the next time she says, love your neighbor. The next time is talking about her grandmother's love. And then the slave who dared to feel like a man. This is about her brother's love for her. I told him that everybody was not cross or unhappy, that those who had pleasant homes and kind friends and were not afraid to love them were happy. But we who were slave children without father or mother could not expect to be happy. We must be good, and perhaps that would bring us contentment. So, her brother Linda asks her why she's sad and says, I'm sorry that you're sad. This is a bad world that we're in. And she said, it's not a bad world because some people have love, but now that we don't have our parents, we've lost that. This is a really critical turn in Harriet Jacobs' story because she goes from talking about family love and her parents and her grandmother and even her brother to talking about a different kind of love. And there's a kind of direct parallel here between Jacob's story and Lizzie's story. Now, I haven't read interviews with Dolan Hubbard Valdez. Is that her name? Or Dolan Perkins Valdez. I haven't read interviews with her. But I would suspect that in order for her to do such a brilliant and wonderful job writing about the lives of these 19th century black women, she read a whole bunch of stuff in that digital Schomburg and did a lot of research, because people who write historical novels are also historians and do a lot of research. So I think looking at the parallels between Jacobs, it's okay, the parallels between Jacobs and Lizzie is going to help us understand how Perkins Valdez is capable of such amazing creativity, but it's also going to give us a deeper look into these questions of love as resistance. So here's what's happened so far in Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl. She starts out introducing her family and saying she didn't even know she was a slave till she was about 8 years old because she had a mother and a father who loved her and who lived together like human beings and had a happy family. And then even when they died prematurely, she still had her grandmother. But then, when she had to move into the home of her master and mistress, the Dr. Flint who sexually harasses her, and his wife who hates her because not of anything Jacobs did, she's 13, but because her husband's a dog and sexually abuses slave women, therefore his wife hates the slave women, which I think is still something that happens today.
That's like that movie. Sorry to interrupt you, but is it? No.
Yeah.
12 Years a Slave.
Yeah.
That was it. Right?
Yeah, the crazy bitch wife who is almost worse than the slave master himself. Yeah. So Northrop talks about that happening. A lot of slave narratives talk about the fact that women who are married to slaveholders become she-devils. They use that term because their husbands are out of control. So think about what it would be like to be married, have a husband who's constantly having sex with all of his employees.
All of his black employees.
Yeah, of a different race. Yeah. But still today, there are instances where women's husbands are cheating, and they're usually cheating with younger women and women in positions of less power. And the wife, who is usually closer in age to the husband, but not always, gets mad as hell. Think about Tiger Woods and Elin. We found out he was a sex addict because she attacked him with a golf club, right? So she attacked Tiger. She didn't go after Tiger's girlfriends. But today, a lot of women will still go after the other women rather than get in the golf club and clubbing their husband like they should if they're upset. Anyway, So Jacobs is now in this vulnerable position. She's experiencing slavery as primarily sexual abuse and sexual vulnerability because there are no laws to protect her from that. And her brother notices that she's sad, and he asks her why she's sad. And she's like, well, we don't have our parents anymore. You know, some people are happy in this world. There's love, but we don't have love anymore, William. But she's also moving from, and so Lizzie is at a point in her life when she's 13 that she has no family, she has no connection. The only way that she can find love is through romantic love. And she accepts what she can get from Drayle, which we might argue is pretty innovative and brave for a 13-year-old girl to make do with what she has. So Jacobs, on the other hand, has this conversation with her brother, who she loves very much, but talks about her brother. The war of my life had begun, and though one of God's most powerless creatures, I resolved never to be conquered. So she keeps making these statements that are really different from Lizzie. Like, okay, I'm powerless, but I am still God's creature, and nobody's going to mess with me. So Jacob's dedication to the fight is a little bit different from the way that Lizzie fights, because she fights by submitting to Drayle, which sounds kind of contradictory. So here is where Jacobs starts to create her own strategies for survival and for resisting her master. She didn't have to create her own strategies when she had her parents to protect her. Now she resolves never to be conquered and to protect herself. So what is the first thing she does to protect herself? She falls in love. Very early in the narrative. Does anybody want to read that kind of middle passage there?
Which one?
It begins with, sorry, I might have lost my place. Oh, yeah. If there was one pure sunny spot for me.
I'll read it.
Yeah, go ahead,
I
please.
don't have my laptop, so I'm just going to read through.
That would be great.
Kind of near something.
Yeah.
If there was one pure sunny spot for me, I believe it to be in Benjamin's heart, and in others, whom I love with all the ardor of a girl's love. My owner knew of it, and sought in every way to render me miserable. He did not resort to corporal punishment, but to all the petty, tyrannical ways that human
Ingenuity.
Oh my God, I knew that word.
It's a lot different when you're reading it on a big screen. Yeah.
Could devise.
Okay. Yeah, you can stop there for a minute. So, what has she announced here? She loves, I'm mixed up. William is her uncle and Benjamin's her brother, or vice versa. But, she has those two, and she has her grandfather, but her uncle runs away eventually, and I think her brother runs away too. So she's kind of left just with her grandmother and with Dr. Flint being a jerk. So what is the first thing that she does after she vows that she's going to protect herself? I loved with all the ardor of a girl's first love. She falls in love with somebody.
So basically, no matter what punishment she's going to face, she doesn't really care.
She's going to choose who to love.
Yeah.
She's going to experience love. And then Dr. Flint knows about it, and he's upset about it, but he doesn't beat her. She says he uses all this petty, tyrannical ways that human ingenuity could devise to punish her, meaning he's going to sexually harass her verbally and torment her and play power games with her to try to stop her from being able to love. So what gets even better about this story, who do you think she's in love with?
Doesn't she fall in love with like a free man?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she falls in love with a man who she calls the colored carpenter, a freeborn man. So, and I just happened to notice too, one of the first ways that she gets punished is that she doesn't have shoes, and that her mistress tells her not to wear her shoes inside because they make an annoying noise and that she'll throw them into the fire. So remember, Lizzie's thing about just having shoes that fit or shoes to protect your feet. There's a lot of kind of strange similarities here. But we're also talking about the level of the physical body and the level of control that both Lizzie and Harriet Jacobs are enduring. Somebody tells them whether or not they can wear shoes. Somebody decides whether they can have shoes that fit or not. This is an extreme level of controlling somebody's body. And when you think about the possibility of having sexual autonomy, of choosing who to love and choosing who to have sex with, if you can't even choose whether or not to wear shoes that fit or whether or not you're going to wear shoes, good luck with choosing your own lover, right? Well, Jacob says she's going to protect herself, and she does it anyway. So she has told us that her father was a really skilled carpenter and that he was a virtuous man who taught her that she was a human being.
So her father was also.
Her father was also a carpenter, yeah. And I spelled carpenter wrong, so now we can't find those sections. So, like Shiloh said, the man that Jacobs tells us she falls in love with was also a carpenter.
Ironic.
Yeah. So her father was a carpenter, so intelligent and skillful in his trade that people called him from out of town to come and work. His strongest wish was to purchase his children, and he offered his earnings for that several times, but never could. Her parents were both biracial. They lived in a comfortable home. She says something about how it was blasphemous for him to teach his children that they were human beings, but she's being ironic. Obviously it's not blasphemous to teach your children that they're human beings. She's just pointing out how blasphemous and profane the system of slavery is. Now, I don't know why I'm not finding Carpenter, her Uncle Philip, also a carpenter. She describes her first lover, I'm going to look up the word free, also as a young colored carpenter, a freeborn man. And maybe I'm searching within a search. I'm going to clear the search and start all over again. So I think what we did there was we looked for chapters that had the word carpenter and whatever the word was that I searched for right before that. So I'm going to try it one more time. Okay.
Do you know when this was published?
1861, but it actually took place in the late 1820s, 1830s.
I think I remember reading this up in high school.
Yeah.
But not like extensively, just briefly because it's very long.
Yeah. I don't know why I can't find the description of a carpenter. I'm just going to cheat a little bit with the search because I know where this stupid section is of the book, and the search isn't working great for me at the moment. Okay. Okay, so why the word carpenter didn't come up for this paragraph, I don't know. But this is the chapter called The Lover. So we found out a little bit earlier that she did have this bright light because she loved somebody, and then she writes a whole chapter about her lover. But of course she begins it, why does the slave ever love? Why bother to fall in love when someone's violent hand can rip it away from you at any moment? But she says she couldn't help it. So there was in the neighborhood a young colored carpenter, a freeborn man. We had been well acquainted in childhood and frequently met together afterwards. We became mutually attached, and he proposed to marry me. I loved him with all the ardor of a young girl's first love. But when I reflected that I was a slave and that the laws gave no sanction to the marriage of such, my heart sank within me. My lover wanted to buy me, but I knew that Dr. Flint was too willful and arbitrary a man to consent to that arrangement. So she's also she's already foreshadowed this situation, where she said earlier, that she's going to protect herself, she's going to fight, and there's this bright spot, she's in love. Well, here's where she fully describes her experience of being in love and choosing this man. And of course, this is very different from Lizzie's experience of being in love. Lizzie talks about having been interested in another young man, but he got sold away, right? You remember that part in the book? But I don't know if it was before or after she started her relationship with Drayle. But this is where we see Jacobs first really start to fight back against her master, who's sexually harassing her. And I find this passage really fascinating. It's interesting that he's also a carpenter, right? Like, what's so great about carpenters?
I think it's because it's her father. Well, not just that, because a carpenter's role is very masculine
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times. And during that time, if you were good at doing that, like, you were very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, her father also did it. So, like, a lot of times women, we kind of, especially black women, we see men, like, through our fathers, like, if we had some sort of influence. Because, like,
Yeah.
for me personally, I never really, like, knew my dad very well. But, like, now we know each other. And it's things about him that I've noticed that the guy that I'm with now are similar. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even know that about you. But it's crazy how you can kind of, like, do that on
That's
accident.
so crazy. Because
So
I see
crazy.
it with me too. Like, I don't have a really good relationship with my father, but I've noticed, like, in the guys that I've been with, they all kind of like act like him. And I'm like,
Is the energies. It's not even about, like, you verbatim remembering things about them, because my dad was in my life when I was a child for a little while, but, like, I was so young I didn't really, you don't remember, but you kind of remember stuff, and then, like, it's just so scary that, like, you can do that and you can absolutely hate that person for so long, but then you end up being with someone that's just like them,
Mm-hmm.
but in more ways good than bad. Like, my
That's
boyfriend, he has way better traits than my father, but,
Mhm.
it's just, over time, you
Yeah.
see that pattern, and it's not because you don't think you're worthy of more or great, it's just because that's all you know as a man or male figure in your life.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and that's how you first learned how to love.
it's your dad. You're
Yeah.
supposed to.
Yeah.
My first love was my mom and my mom.
Yeah.
uh-huh.
But in terms of, but even little children, I think, are aware of the difference between mom and dad, right? And so to a certain extent, the ideal of a man is whatever ideal we have of dad. And if we don't have a dad at all, then maybe we have an uncle or some other family member that's going to suggest that role model. And I think even for women who are lesbians or bisexual, I think that the qualities that they look for possibly might still be, they don't look for someone like their mom, maybe.
Right.
I don't know if this is true, but that would just be too weird. I can't even handle that. So he's a carpenter. He's like her father. She has this strong sense of how to love, so she loves in a way that keeps things, close to her family and her identity. This is about having a positive black identity, because her black father, who she later describes as being light-colored and what people would call a mulatto, like, that's not important. It's just a detail about him. Her black father is a virtuous worker and this wonderful man. Then she falls in love with a young man who has a lot of his qualities. Thinking about the Carpenters, though, Harriet Jacobs is telling the true story of her life, but when she emphasizes something, she does it for really brilliant reasons. What other things do we know about carpenters? Yes, they're builders. Their work that they do is that they create something that is really important. So therefore, if you are a car mechanic, okay, cars are running, that's nice. But if you're a carpenter, you can keep going back and looking at what the carpenter built. So they do a particularly kind of merit build kind of
There's a
work.
vision, like, before they even create something, so maybe that's something that is covered also, like, in their minds, maybe they're thinking, like, it really takes a lot of thought. Like, at that time, it was probably a smart job,
Yeah.
for someone to have, like, oh, that means he can
Yeah, it's like being an engineer too. So if you all met a carpenter tomorrow who you were going to marry, what's the first thing you would have him or her build? A house, exactly. And having a home of your own. What did you say? A house with a really big closet. But think about the importance of family and home in place. And Jacob's father not only built a family through his love and his leadership, but also he could physically build a home, which is a place of protection and safety, and she wants protection. She says she's going to build, protect herself. But even her choice of who she falls in love with is a guy who can build a house, and those walls will protect you. So there's something more about protection. Lizzie doesn't have have as concrete ways to protect herself as Harriet Jacobs does. She doesn't have even the memory of a father. She doesn't have a grandmother. She doesn't have a carpenter to build her a home. So all she gets is that little cottage in Ohio during the summer. But the ways that she describes him are pretty fascinating. He also wants to buy her. Her father wanted to buy her. Here we have the second black man who is a worker, who can create incredibly important things, who can protect, and who wants to get her out of this situation of slavery. So think about how she depicts black men in this novel. Her brother, her uncle, her father, and this carpenter versus the white men we get to meet. Kind of telling us something about what manhood should really be like. And it's this, I'm sorry, I said this novel, it's not a novel. In her narrative, she creates an image of black masculinity that probably is still an ideal image of black masculinity. Meanwhile, she really shows white men for all that they can possibly be in the worst case scenario. Grab them by the pussy, sexually offensive, greedy, mind game playing. Oh, I didn't say that. Yeah, but I guess I didn't say that. So think about it. Here's Harriet Jacobs, who is still enslaved when she's writing this, pretty much saying that white men are sexually deviant, greedy rapists, and black men are these virtuous, self-sacrificing, kind providers who want nothing more than to be a father and an honorable husband and create a home for their family. And so Jacobs, by choosing love, is saying, and if we could just only have our love and not be bothered, black men can take care of us. The black family can take care of itself. She's saying a lot about autonomy and independence in telling the story this way. Lizzie doesn't have those choices for autonomy and independence, but she becomes a mother. And we're not going to discredit the tie of the mother with the child either. Fathers are great, but if you don't, your mother's just got to be there most of the time. So this is a really interesting moment of contrast. But the other interesting thing about Jacob's relationship with this lover is that it's the first time that she stands up to Dr. Flint and she's ready to fight him. So he says, she gets in this argument with Dr. Flint, and she knows that she's kind of stuck. And she doesn't want to marry the carpenter because if he's her husband and she's still a slave, he's not really going to be able to protect her. He's not going to be able to do anything, and Flint's probably then just going to rape her just to show that he can. So he nonetheless calls on her, and she also tells a story actually of the past where her mistress hears that one of the slaves wants to get married and says, "I've heard that you want to get married." And the mistress says, "I will have you peeled and pickled, my lady. If ever you mention that subject again, do you suppose that I will have you tending my children with the children of that?" And you know what it says next. So think about, that level of control too. Like a woman wants to get married and her mistress says, "No, you can't even get married because Then you'll have children, and your only role in the world is to tend my children. And I don't want them to play with black children. Really messed up levels of control and hatred and destruction of the family going on here. Fran, the only reason I think that Fran, well, I don't know. Why do you think Fran tolerates, sometimes embraces Lizzie's children?
Because she doesn't have any of them.
Yeah, she doesn't have any of her own. They look white. When her nephew's around, she kicks him out of the house again because she has a whiter substitute, right? So in some ways, Fran is kind of saying the same thing. My own flesh and blood, this real white kid can't be around these black kids, even though they're also related to my husband. But this thing, peeled and pickled, I've been obsessed with lately. I will have you peeled and pickled, my lady. Have you ever heard that before? You've heard it before, Deja?
When they would, well, this was a theory that I read once, and I don't know if this is true, but when they would lynch or whatever, kill slaves, they would peel their skin, or while they were still living, they would peel them alive, and they would pickle the skin, meaning they would use like vinegar
And salt.
to, disgusting. It's like sick on another level. Like, it just really makes me
that
want
much
to watch.
hatred?
Yeah, like I could never like imagine that, but I mean, some of the stuff that they went through was so like terrible.
The physical part of it, like
yeah.
your
And
shoes
it's so much
don't
that we
fit.
still don't know. Like there's
Yeah.
like so many stories I have questions about, like the peach story that I heard.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about? And,
The peach story?
The Nassau peach, not Nassau peach, what is it called? It's in Nassau, Massachusetts. And they have like the largest peaches in the world because on that land they would rape and kill black women on that specific part of the land, and then now it's like these peaches, but no one eats them because they like know like okay, there's like soil
There's blood
under
in the
there that
soil,
make
yeah.
like slave bones. I don't really want any of that stuff.
Most of Converse Heights
Yeah,
used to be a
and, like,
plantation. So like when I grow things in my backyard, I think a little bit in these terrible
it
terms.
just makes you curious. I mean, like that's just rumors, but I kind of believed it just because like it was an execution thing too, because it was like a black Holocaust.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about now?
absolutely,
Like they
yeah.
went to these fields and they like put them there. And,
They're
like,
killing
had them
fields.
killed or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
animals. Like,
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and possibly it's where they dumped bodies, after the Middle Passage too. Could look it up. The peeled and pickled thing is just another example of how absolutely brilliant Harriet Jacobs is, because someone who understands slavery is going to know that they would whip people till their skin was practically peeled off, and then they would pour salt water and vinegar on it, supposedly to heal it, but the pain of pouring salt water and vinegar on a wound is
Yes.
First
unfathomable.
of all, vinegar by itself. Like,
Salt by itself.
Jesus.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Have you guys ever had like a cut in your finger and eat like some French fries? That thing
Yeah.
hurts.
Right. So Jacobs is
Or
telling.
like some salt baths, like if you're like sore, like I don't know, like it's
Yeah.
I can't.
Jacobs is telling an audience that knows about the horrors of slavery something that's horrific and like a horror movie. On the other hand, I will have you peeled and pickled, young lady. To a northern white woman reader, she's not going to get the full impact of that. She's going to be like, why is this lady talking about making cucumbers?
I do not understand the Southern lingo at all.
I just understood because of
Yeah.
what I read. Like if I hadn't read that article, I would have never known either.
Yeah.
What she's talking about.
But the peeled and pickled is just kind of a very seemingly domestic. When you make pickles, you're not supposed to peel them. But, her happy northern white lady readers are not going to get the horror version of this. They're going to be like, oh, yes, canning things, peeling and pickling and putting things up for the winter. It's not going to be an affront to their sensibilities in the same way that it is to anyone who understands slavery. So she's able to use images like that relate and tell a totally different story to do different audiences. But then she has her first fight with Dr. Flint. So she's thinking about what to do, and Dr. Flint calls her in and says to her, here's the dialogue. You want to be married? Yes, sir. Well, I'll soon convince you whether I am your master. If you must have a husband, just take up with one of my slaves. And that line itself practically makes me throw up. So what he's saying is that if you are a black woman, there can only be one reason you would want a husband. And any man will do. Because it's clearly just about sex. So that's a pretty hideous insult right there. He actually gets worse. And she tells him that she loves him. He calls her a puppy. This is really bizarre. Like, we go into this little puppy thing. I thought you would feel above the insults of such puppies. If he is a puppy, I am a puppy. He would not love me if he did not believe me to be a virtuous woman. He sprang upon me like a tiger. I don't know if maybe she uses the puppy image because, again, for her northern white readers, they're like, oh, cute little puppies, not dangerous. The black man is also not dangerous. He's like a puppy and he can build a house and he's... But then Dr. Flint is a tiger. He's the dangerous predatory beast. And that message comes through pretty clearly for a reader independent of what perspective they come from. So Drayle kind of starts off a little bit more like a puppy. He doesn't necessarily have those tiger moments, but then we see the tiger and we see the real depraved master, more in Mawu's master and in Rini's brother than we do in other parts of the story. But still, we have Jacob start her fight and resolve to protect herself through love.
I had a question about something that you put up there already. It was about the wife. Why did she? It was a line that was right there. She was basically saying she didn't. God, I lost it. It was when they were talking about. It was just right there. I can't remember.
Yeah, I'll scroll up. The mistress. The part about the mistress is right up here.
Okay, why would she not want her to, in what way would she want to get rid of her, being married or something that she didn't want her to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question too.
Just because I was like, well, I mean, you would think she would have been happy and okay, good, but maybe. I don't know. Her way of losing her, she would probably want her to suffer.
Well, there's a couple things going on, and this brings in an interesting comparison with Fran. Because Fran sometimes likes to feel like she's the great healing friend to Lizzie. And sometimes she's just awful to Lizzie and sends her out to the quarters. And so the psychological complexity of Fran or of Jacob's mistress are kind of parallel in a lot of ways too. The mistress wants to be rid of Jacob, so she would like her sold, preferably sold down the river, so she has a harder life and gets abused more probably. But Jacobs knows that her mistress doesn't want her just to be sold to her future husband and then go and live a happy life. And Jacobs actually has the precedent of the mistress saying to her slave girl, no, you can't just go marry some man and have little black children who are going to be around my children. You're only here to serve me. So it's part of the mistress not being able to imagine the humanity of the woman she has enslaved. But it's also the depravity and the sadistic behavior of the mistress, just not wanting her to be happy, not wanting her to have a family. And part of Jacob's argument is that slavery gives slaveholders and their wives so much power over people, puts the wives in a particularly also disempowered position, that it makes them into really sick fuckers. So that's the literary term.
That's in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's the 21st century interpretation of the word she-devil. So, yeah. But even the mistress, because she's so jealous and because she's, and has become part of this power situation that's sadistic. Have you heard about those psychological experiments that they do where I think they supposedly did this experiment at Harvard. It's a famous psych experiment where they pay people to press a button, and they say, every time you press this button, the person in the room next door is going to be electrocuted. But we'll pay you every time you press the button. When you press, I think the weird part is when the people in the experiment, and people didn't know the experiment was messing with them, they really weren't electrocuting anybody, but when they pressed the button and they couldn't hear anybody being tortured, versus when they pressed the button and they did the experiment where they had screaming and crying and sounds, there's two different groups, right? The people who pressed the button and didn't hear another human being suffering, and the people who pressed the button and did hear another human being suffering. And they're both being paid. Who do you think pressed the button more?
The one I can't hear stuff.
Uh-uh.
Really?
Wasn't it like every time you press the button, they would like increase the voltage?
Uh-huh. No, you get paid more.
But they would increase the
Yeah.
voltage too.
Yeah. So something that psychologists argue about the human psyche is that if we have power, we lose our empathy. Because you should have more empathy. You should be able to put yourself in the other person's place if you can hear them. But if you have complete power over someone, your empathy goes away. So the person who couldn't hear the screaming would have to use their imagination to think, oh God, what's happening? Is this person dead? Is it, and they would still have to actively engage their empathy. But when you know and it's clear cut, you can detach yourself from it, and it's not what you're thinking is happening, it's someone else, and you can separate it from yourself and compartmentalize, and you can become even more dangerous. So that's part of the argument about how slavery really makes people who own slaves toxic, dangerous, horrible. And from what Jacobs tells us, and from what Dylan Perkins Valdez tells us, the people who are enslaved actually become innovative, empathetic, supportive of each other, and continue to grow as human beings. Even though their bodies are in great jeopardy, their spirit, their psyche, their mind doesn't necessarily get damaged in the same way as the slaveholders. So if we think about the difference between the people who are enslaved in Jacob's narrative, who are virtuous and noble people, there's a couple who kind of go bad in Jacob's narrative, and there's a couple who kind of go bad in Perkins Valdez. But for the most part, it's more morally damaging to own slaves than it is to be a slave. So if we put that in a 21st century context, is it more morally damaging to have power over people or to be in a position of marginalization and to be oppressed?
That's the What was your last one?
So the argument in Jacobs and in Perkins Valdez is that if you have power over people, you lose your empathy, you're morally damaged, you become a really sick fuck. That's my new official term for it. However, if you're struggling, the ways that human beings can go about surviving are usually to make connections, to love each other, to support each other, and to survive in ways that do require empathy and don't make you into a sociopath. That's what happens in the novels about slavery. So think about maybe a similar situation today. Think about like prison guards and people who are imprisoned. If you know anything about that. Can you think of other situations where, certain people have a lot of power and control, and then there are people who are clearly kind of victimized by them?
I think maybe like nurse aides and like elderly people homes, like old people homes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So the nurses' aides can sometimes become the dangerous ones because they have power over the elderly people. But the elderly people don't lose their humanity necessarily, right?
Yeah.
They're just
Torture.
Well, I mean, like, no. I guess, yeah, that's a better word.
yeah.
But I mean, to sit in your own shit all day.
Yeah.
Then that's torture. I wouldn't
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to do that. So
Yeah.
I think that mentally will do something to you, like, for sure.
Starve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Receive your medication.
Yeah.
Thirsty or whatever.
So in a situation of elder abuse, then you're saying that despite the suffering and the struggle, the people who are abused are still fully human and they don't become morally depraved. But having too much power over them is dangerous for the people who take care of them. There's other things that are dangerous about that situation too, because the people who have to take care of the elderly and that abuse them are very often not paid, have to work, 7, 12-hour shifts in a row. It's still not okay, right?
You still
Yeah.
do the job. Like, if you really
Go
hate
find
old
another
people.
job.
So let's take it up a level to the directors of the nursing home who know that's happening
Even worse.
They're
and
just
aren't
filling in
directly
spots,
perpetrating,
like,
but are making a lot of money and creating this system. And then we could think about Catholic Church abuse with the priests who are sexually abusing children. And yeah, that's damaging, but those children do not become abusers. They very often, now they're telling about it. But then we find out that the bishops and other people who knew that these priests were doing it were letting them do it too. So who's really like the most morally messed up there, Is it just letting it happen and not intervening? There's something wrong with the person who's compelled to abuse a child. But if we know about it and we're like, go get over it, not a big deal, who's really morally more corrupt this day and age?
everyone involved. Like even the R. Kelly situation, I would say, that's the only thing that popped in my mind at the time.
Yeah, like anybody who knew
Even
it was
the
happening.
Parents, I know, yeah, he did what he did, but like, you let your child like go with an older man, like you don't have enough sense to be like, okay, like I clearly see like that's not a good option for my daughter. She's too young to do that, but like I don't know. I mean, they're not completely to blame, but like in a they have some responsibility because it's like my mom wouldn't care who it is. She wouldn't care if it was Michael Jackson, whoever. She would be like, you're not going with them by yourself. Like,
Yeah.
especially at 14 and 15 years old. Like, no, I don't
Yeah.
care what you're trying to do. Like,
But having that power is going to damage your morals.
yeah, because he knew how talented he was, and he assumed that him being that talented, he could get away with. Well, he had been getting away with all the things and all the connections he had in Chicago. How like anything that was brought to the police, it was just somehow it disappeared. It wasn't there anymore. So it's like, I don't know. I think when you get away with something for that long,
Yeah.
and then you finally get caught, you become a victim at some point because you're like, I was doing it this whole time. Like, how am I in trouble now? Like, where?
Yeah. So wealth and privilege, R. Kelly, people associated with him sharing his wealth and privilege, and then the victims, who are very young girls. Keeping in mind that everything that R. Kelly has done probably the majority of wealthy white male entertainers also did for most of the 20th and well into the 21st century. And it's somehow not as interesting as when R. Kelly does it. But yeah, having too much power over people. Some Black Lives Matter activists argue that our policing system puts police officers in a dehumanizing position where they lose their humanity and their empathy because and then police will say, no, it's like we're really afraid, we're not protected, So whether, but most police officers do admit that there are those bad cops who will kill somebody because they can get away with it. And then there's a lot of good cops who are kind of stuck in the middle. But
Yeah, it's hard with that situation because you got bad in both areas and good in both areas. So I mean,
yeah,
it's hard to like, who's the good one, who's the bad one,
Yeah.
who's telling the truth and who's lying.
yeah. I mean, what's really important is that people who are the bystanders, really need to tell the truth and not be bullied or afraid to do the right thing to protect people who have no protection. So yeah, bullying, power, stuff like that. Okay, so we did a really, really close reading